Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I made a mistake. I was not looking ahead at my calendar last week when I was recording shows, and if I had, I would have made a programming note. This week is actually spring break week. And again, it just escaped my notice. But with it being spring break week, both of my kids are off school. Now, my wife and I are actually going to be taking my eldest, who is my son, on a number of college visits this week. That's how we're going to utilize that time. So I guess the good news is for the Foggy Dew family is that my son is growing up. He's taking another step in his life. My wife and I are going to go help him with that. But I guess the bad news for the Foggy Dew family is that today's show is going to be a little bit short, and I'll be back later in the week. So I guess diving into the meat of the show then, I wanted to go ahead and talk about a big date that occurred over the weekend. Now, a very big event historically occurred about 2,000 years ago. Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15th in 44 BC, the Ides of March. That assassination occurred 2,069 years ago, and it is still remembered today. I think that is so interesting. So interesting. That's how important Caesar was to humanity. I just think 2,000 years ago, and we still remember this event. But it's interesting when you look at Caesar. Caesar crossed the Rubicon back in 49 BC, and I've talked about that on the show before. So Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and basically he ended the Roman Republic. That act of defying the Senate plunged Rome into what they called Caesar's Civil War. Well, you might ask yourself, why did Caesar get killed just 5 years later? Well, there were a few reasons for that. Number one is Caesar, after he had become dictator, he basically didn't care about the Senate anymore. So the Senate would convene, and Caesar would not stand when they walked in. It would be like a courtroom and then not standing when the judge walked in. You're basically saying that I don't care about you. But when the Senate was held, Caesar viewed it all as a sham. He would not rise to give them the prestige that they thought that they deserved. But that subtle sign of disrespect by not standing rankled the Senate. Another issue was that Caesar had taken on the affects of a king. He would walk around Rome and the people would cheer him, Rex, Rex. Well, what Rex means is king. So the people were calling him king. Well, when the people called him Rex, he would reply, non sum Rex, said Caesar. Translated, that means, I am not king, but Caesar. This arrogance of speaking to the people in that way was another thing that just angered the Senate, rankled the Senate. The final straw for the Senate was symbolic. Now, you might have heard of the name Mark Antony, but Mark Antony was Caesar's co-counsel. Well, while the Senate was in session, Mark Antony put a wreath on Caesar's head. It was like crowning him. So Mark Antony drops this wreath on Caesar's head and stated, quote, the people give you this through me, end quote. But doing that in front of the Senate, it was basically like Mark Antony crowning Caesar king. All of these things, the disrespect, saying he's Caesar, not king, crowning him in front of them, all of those events led the Senate to believe that Caesar wanted to be a king. Because of these things, the Senate started plotting to kill Caesar. The main conspirators to kill Caesar were names you've probably heard of: Cassius, Cicero, Brutus. Now, it's interesting, historically, when you kill a king, you normally purge all of his followers, right? You chop the head off. In this case, though, the Senate believed that killing Caesar himself was sufficient. If they could kill Caesar, they could then reassume control of the Roman Republic. The place in which they killed Caesar would be important too. They wanted to kill him in the Senate. They wanted that to have a veneer of law. So on March 15th, the conspirators sprang their trap. So here's Caesar. He goes to the Senate that day, March 15th, 44 BC. And it's interesting, too, before I get into the actual assassination, Caesar knew that there was a plot afoot. He knew that there was a conspiracy to kill him, but he went anyway. So Caesar goes to the Senate and then takes his seat. Now, the first stab was by a man named Casca, who was a senator. Casca glanced Caesar in the neck. As Casca did that, he yelled, "Brother, help me," meaning he's calling for the other senators to help him. Caesar was then rushed. Caesar was attacked from all directions. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. He was stabbed 23 times by 60 men on the Senate floor. Now, Caesar's last words were in Greek. He did not say "E tu Brutus." He said these words in Greek. Translated, the words meant, quote, "You too, child." Now, the final fatal wound was to his ribs. That was the death blow, but ultimately, Caesar died of blood loss. So here's Caesar lying dead on the Senate floor. Brutus went throughout Rome saying, quote, "People of Rome, we are once again free." That act of murdering Caesar, of assassinating Caesar, plunged Rome back into another civil war. Remember what I said about Caesar walking around the streets of Rome and the people would cheer him Rex, Rex. Well, Caesar was very, very popular with the lower classes. These lower class people were enraged that aristocrats would do this. So civil war then raged in Rome after the assassination of Caesar. Now, it's interesting historically, the final civil war in Rome was between Mark Antony and Cleopatra versus Octavian. Octavian was Caesar's nephew. Well, in that final civil war, Octavian prevailed. Mark Antony and Cleopatra actually fled to Alexandria and committed suicide in 30 BC. Well, after they committed suicide, Octavian took over and renamed himself Augustus. Augustus was actually viewed then as a deity, but Augustus became the founder of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the Western Empire, fell almost 500 years later in 476 AD. The Eastern Empire of the Roman Empire fell in 1453. The Eastern Empire fell in 1453 when Constantinople fell, but the empire, in one form or another, after that act, lasted almost 1,500 years. But Julius Caesar assassinated March 15th, 44 BC, over 2,000 years ago. Just an interesting day. I love Caesar. The whole thing about the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire to me is just totally fascinating, but I thought I would share it. So hopefully you enjoyed that little story. So switching gears, I have a bunch of quick hits here. There's so much going on in politics right now. I started to write out these kind of longer analyses, but there's just too much going on. And I guess I would start my kind of world tour of quick hits talking about Iran. Now, last week I had talked about Karg Island. I said, watch Karg Island. Well, over the weekend, the US military bombed Karg Island. So you got a little bit of a preview of Karg Island last week on the Foggy Dew. Now, it's interesting with the bombing of Karg Island, the oil infrastructure on the island is still standing. And I guess that's the main takeaway when I'm looking at Iran now is what's going on at Karg Island in the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at Karg Island and the surgical decapitation that's occurred in this area, I mean, Iran effectively, guys, has been neutered. Within, 2 weeks, their navy is totally sunk. Most of Iran's missiles have been spent or destroyed. And I guess my takeaway from all of this, Iran is not going to be able to terrorize the world anymore by choking global oil flow. The United States has total air supremacy over Iran. They established that in a week. They have total naval supremacy. We've got radar, we've got the eye in the sky and satellites looking down, watching everything that's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. But our Navy is doing whatever it wants in the Strait of Hormuz. And looking forward, the only thing I can tell you is the Iranian regime is going to capitulate. They're going to capitulate or they're going to continue to be destroyed. And my suspicion with this whole thing with Iran is that you're going to have a real peace accord soon. You've got these Gulf oil producers like the UAE, Qatar, all these, plus Israel. I think what's going to happen is you have all these nations that are over in the Middle East. They're going to finally agree that the enemy of their enemy is their friend. And I think what happens long term is that these countries are going to keep Karg secure, backed by the US Navy. And I guess just looking at Karg Island, don't be surprised if Marines land on Karg Island to secure it. But I guess just backing away from this whole situation, because I'm kind of looking like what's next in Iran. This is a generational win economically. Iran is not going to be able to use places like the UAE anymore. They won't have an economic refuge. They can't park their money there. And I guess I just look at this whole thing is that the US is basically just severing the head, and the Middle East countries are going to patrol the carcass after we're done. And I guess the broad scope of this, I look at this entire situation in Iran, is just a huge USA flex. The USA is the world's lone superpower. I mean, Russia couldn't even beat Ukraine after 4 years. In the way that I look at this whole thing, China can't oppose us now. We've got our thumb on the screw basically across the globe now. China's certainly not invading Taiwan, I know that. And if you look at Iran, Iran is being humiliated here. BRICS is on life support. I just think Donald Trump has done such an amazing job in Iran, and the reality is we'll get out of there soon enough. But I just think the surgical precision with which the Trump administration moved on Iran, how badass our military is. Again, the guy knows exactly where to hit each regime. It's the stress fault that can't go down. That was Karg Island. But you control the Strait of Hormuz, you're going to control 20 to 30% of global oil shipping. So I guess the second quick hit that I'm looking at is Cuba. And I think everybody knows this. Cuba's up next. The capture of Venezuela cut half of Cuba's oil supply. China is not able to get in. Russia is not able to get in. None of these countries can resupply Cuba because the US Navy has an embargo around it. The US Navy is sitting there basically surrounding Cuba at this point. And I don't know if you've been paying attention or not, but there have been rolling blackouts in Cuba because they can't even keep their energy grid going. And right now, Cuban citizens are like burning down communist buildings. The Cuban citizenry is demanding change. And I guess if you look at it more broadly, look at it from a communist perspective, the Cuban communist regime is failing in real time. And I guess the Cuban communist shell is there, but the inside is totally hollow. So the regime hasn't fallen yet, but it will. You guys are watching all this stuff occur. You know as well as I do it's going to fail. And it's interesting because now Marco Rubio, he's now talking with Cuban leaders. And look, I hope Marco Rubio can really expand that, talk to these Cuban leaders. But I think economic trade and prosperity for the Cuban people is right around the corner. But Cuba is the next domino to fall in this hemisphere. I just think we are watching the world being reshaped a brick at a time by the Trump administration. And just as a side note with Marco Rubio, how brilliant is this guy? I wouldn't be surprised if people wanted Marco Rubio and JD Vance as the VP, or even like a Rubio DeSantis. Marco Rubio is just an absolute all-star, just a total rock. I don't know if I've ever seen a cabinet member like that. Marco Rubio is just a shining star. It's so amazing. So another quick hit, the SAVE Act vote is going to be on Wednesday. And there is going to be no talking filibuster, so this whole thing is going to fail legislatively. And I guess it's just, if you look at the SAVE Act, I talked about it on the show before, the fact that they're not going to do a talking filibuster and they're going to go in a normal filibuster with a 60 vote threshold, these professional losers are going in knowing this is going to fail. This is a massive Republican establishment rhino fail. And I guess the only wrinkle coming out of this, when I look at what's going on here, the last day for John Cornyn to drop out of the Texas runoff is on Tuesday. Well, the vote here on the SAVE Act is going to be on Wednesday. So here's John Cornyn, the scumbag, is going to be able to vote yes on the SAVE Act, knowing it's going to fail. So his buddy Thune is setting up Cornyn to say, hey, look at me, I voted for the SAVE Act. Cornyn and Thune are a total disgrace. 95% of Republicans want this, and these two self-involved losers are just putting their thumb on the scale for the Republican Party and, quite frankly, for the Republic. And John Thune is going to go down as one of the worst people ever. He is easily the worst Senate Majority Leader I've ever seen. These guys have done absolutely nothing. Not only are they not doing anything, they're not even confirming Trump's picks for judges. None of Trump's recommendations are going through. These guys are doing everything they can to stonewall Donald Trump legislatively. And you look at it as a voter, it's just total betrayal by a political party. Not only is it total betrayal, I think the bright light of this, the silver lining, is its total exposure. These rhinos are out in a spotlight. Everybody's going to be hating on these people. They're being exposed as snakes, as liars, as traitors. And I guess when I look at all this stuff, I mean, the fact that they're even going through it, they know this thing's going to fail. It's just kabuki theater. You're going to have a bunch of grown-ups doing a puppet show in DC on Wednesday. And I guess if I look at this, good, let's get this out of the way, because after Wednesday, the fireworks are really going to start. If you think the Republican base is mad, just wait. You're going to go to DEFCON 5 overnight. But I guess to me, it's going to be so interesting to watch how this whole thing plays out, because if I'm Donald Trump, I let this go on for a few weeks. If you know the SAVE Act's going to fail, let people stew on this for 2 weeks. Let all the analysis occur. The base is going to be so angry in a couple weeks, he'll be able to leverage that anger correctly. So I guess if I'm Donald Trump, I'm going to get everybody nice and angry about the Republican establishment. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. We will have voter ID. We will have proof of citizenship by the midterms. I get one way or the other. And I guess it's kind of like me talking about Carg Island before we invade Carg Island. It's the same thing. It's predictive politics. All of this seems to me to be following like a logical chain of progression of thought. But trust me, we are going to have voter ID. We are going to have proof of citizenship required by November, by executive order, by declassification. But if you think Donald Trump is going to let this go down, where these guys are going to let it fail legislative and there's not going to be a penalty that gets paid, I don't know what else to tell you, but I watch what Donald Trump does on the global stage. It's literally like 3D chess, brilliant maneuvering. I really don't think that he's going to be taken down by guys like John Cornyn and John Thune. And anyway, again, shame on those two guys. But trust me, we'll all be watching this week. It is going to be a clown show. So switching gears, I got a lot of positive feedback about the Jack Buck World War II story. And I was sitting there thinking about it. I actually have another really cool World War II St. Louis story. Now, the other World War II St. Louis story I have is about a guy named Edward Butch O'Hare. Well, Butch was born in St. Louis in 1914. And a lot of St. Louis people don't know this, but Alton, Illinois, which is right across the river, Alton, Illinois used to have a military academy. Well, that military academy was called Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois. Butch attended Western Military Academy. Well, after he graduated from Western Military, Butch went to Annapolis. So he went to the Naval Academy. Well, after graduating the Naval Academy, he entered flight school. He entered flight school and he finished up in 1940. Well, obviously, if you're talking 1940, you're talking World War II. So Butch eventually found himself in the Pacific Theater. Now, Butch had been assigned to a aircraft carrier called the USS Lexington. So on February 20th, 1942, the Lexington sees Japanese bombers on the radar. So they see this large squad of Japanese bombers about 43 miles away. Well, what happened? The Lexington scrambled all its planes and dispatched all of them to go after that pack of bombers, except for two planes. Two planes, and one of them was Butch. So here you have all the planes get up off the aircraft carrier, they fly away to intercept the bombers. Well, while they're away engaged with that first wave of bombers, a second wave of bombers appears on the radar. Now, this second wave of bombers is headed directly at the Lexington. Well, again, remember, there's only 2 planes left. Butch and another aircraft are then scrambled to intercept this second wave. So here's Butch and his wingman. They fly out to intercept these bombers coming in. There were 8 bombers. Well, you kind of have a numbers problem there. You have 2 fighter pilots versus 8 bombers. Well, they rapidly had another problem, which is that Butch's wingman, his gun's jammed. So you basically have Butch alone by himself now. Now, the problem that he had was this, Butch's problem. He only has 450 rounds of 50 cal on his plane, which means he has enough for 10 3-second bursts. He does not have a lot of ammunition. He's not loaded down to take on 8 bombers. So here is Butch by himself. He doesn't have enough ammunition to take on 8 bombers, so he has to make every shot count. So what did Butch do? He flew up above the bombers. Dives and strafes. Dives and strafes. Dives and strafes. The bombers, imagine the bombers coming across. They're shooting at this guy like crazy. But he keeps diving and strafing him, diving and strafing him. Well, Butch, doing that dive and strafe, knocked out 5 bombers. The other 3 were so severely damaged that they had to pull away. So Butch destroys 5 Japanese bombers by himself and saves the Lexington. You might be curious, but his plane only took 1 bullet. All that shooting, 1 bullet went in the plane, and Butch himself was totally unharmed. Well, not only is he unharmed, he is now a huge hero. So here's the hero Butch. He's promoted to lieutenant commander. You shoot down 5 bombers, you're immediately a flying ace. Well, what else happened? He won a Medal of Honor. FDR presented him with the Medal of Honor. Well, in 1942, the United States needed a hero like that. So Butch was then sent back after that action. He was sent back to the States to sell war bonds. Butch got a parade in his hometown of St. Louis. 60,000 people showed up to celebrate this American hero. Not just an American hero, a St. Louis hero. So Butch stayed in the United States for about a year going on a war bonds tour. Well, in 1943, then, he was deployed back into the Pacific Theater. Butch oversaw 3 squadrons at that point as a commander. He was the ultimate leader. He wanted everybody just to call him Butch. He put on no airs. Well, as the war progressed, the Japanese lost air supremacy. What that meant was that the Japanese would not attack during the day. They didn't have the ships for day-to-day combat, for daylight operation, day combat. So the Japanese would only really attack at night. So on November 26th, 1943, the Japanese attacked Butch's ship, which at the time was called the Enterprise. And this is at night, so Butch is scrambled to intercept the Japanese fighters. Well, because it was night, it got very confusing on the deck of the Enterprise, and unfortunately, Butch was caught in a crossfire. He was caught in a crossfire, and they never found his plane. So Butch, the St. Louis hero, died in the Pacific. Now, it's interesting, there were a couple facts about Butch that I wanted to dive into that make the story even more interesting. I mentioned that he was from St. Louis. Well, Butch's parents had divorced when he was 13 years old. So his mom and the kids stayed in St. Louis, but his dad moved to Chicago. Now, his dad moved to Chicago, and his dad was a lawyer. His dad was a lawyer for Al Capone. So here's Butch's dad. He's a lawyer for Al Capone who turned on Al Capone. Butch's dad, the lawyer, provided the evidence that led to Capone's arrest on tax evasion. Well, I don't know much, but if you turn on a mobster like Al Capone, you're a marked man. So in 1939, when Butch was in flight school, his dad was gunned down. His dad was gunned down in broad daylight, and the gunmen were never caught. And obviously, it was assumed that that was a Capone hit. It's so interesting looking at this guy's life and all, like Al Capone, he wins a Medal of Honor. But Butch was honored in a few other ways. In 1945, after his death, the USS O'Hare was named in his honor. And if O'Hare sounds familiar, it's also the name of O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Butch O'Hare, first Navy flying ace of World War II, first naval aviator to win a Medal of Honor in World War II. But Butch O'Hare, a St. Louis kid and a badass American hero. Okay, guys, I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. Hopefully you enjoyed the shorter episode. Again, I'll be in and out this week doing college visits. So pray for my pray for my kid's 529 that I have enough money in it. But anyway, I'll do the best I can on a show later this week. So if you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have any questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.